Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association, and I am delighted to have Marlene Harris-Taylor from API join us today to talk about community engagement. Welcome to News Media Connect, Marlene. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I'm delighted to be here and to share a little bit about community engagement from the American Press Institute perspective. We've been working with news organizations across the country to sort of refine what community engagement is and to share some best practices and some case studies. So I'm happy to do that today. So I'm going to start by sharing my presentation. So we're calling this one Ask Me Anything because we're trying to cover a wide variety of issues that people may have questions about in terms of community engagement. So I'm going to start just talking a little bit about who we are because some of you may not be familiar with API. We are a nonprofit organization that supports local newsrooms to help them grow and thrive and be more responsive to their communities. And we do that through research, through programs just like this one, where we're sharing information, and through innovative products. Again, we're doing this to strengthen the future of local journalism, which is one of the things that API is all about. So I want you to think about this for a moment as we get started. And I hope this is one thing that you take away with you, that there was a time when, as a local news organization, it was about filling information needs for the local community. But now, news organizations, particularly local news organizations, have to go beyond that and think about being a connector. Think about being an organization that brings together, convenes people for conversations. And in terms of community engagement, think about how we can bring folks together to begin to co-create. Because that's something that, as news organizations, we've always been the ones holding all the power. We've always been the ones making all the decisions. As we move into this new world where people are expecting more from their local news organizations, we feel at API that it's time to sort of bring down the walls, take away some of the veil, let people see behind the curtain, and think about how they might co-create with us. So here's our roadmap for this conversation today. We're going to talk about journalists as conveners and connectors. Going to share some tools to advance engagement in local news and a few case studies to consider. And then we'll take questions. So when journalistic organizations, national and local, began to think about engaging with audiences in a different way, there was a term that we all began to use that was called audience engagement. And audience engagement was really about a one-to-one or kind of platform specific. So bringing people to your website, how many clicks on a certain story. If you have a newsletter, how many people are opening the newsletter? What's the open rate? It was about connecting with the audience that you have, but connecting in a very specific way and bringing them to your content. That's audience engagement, which is slightly different from community engagement. When you begin to think about community engagement as a newsroom, it goes beyond just bringing people to your platform to consume the news that you've created. It's about finding out what's really important to the folks in your community, and also thinking about, are there voices that are being left out? And are there people beyond the ones who come and read or consume our content on a regular basis that we would like to reach, but we're not currently reaching? Well, community engagement has become the way that news organizations are thinking about, how do we connect with the community that we are responsible for the community that we're a part of in a new way that's beyond that audience engagement model. And what we hope to evolve to as news organizations across the country, this would really be the panacea, if you will, to evolve to restorative engagement. And what is restorative engagement? Restorative engagement is thinking beyond what we have done, how we've connected to communities, but then what we as news organizations are responsible for in terms of harm to communities. Because some of our practices, some of our past practices, have not felt good to certain communities that we're supposed to be serving. So, how do we think about, as news organizations, how we can evolve and begin to correct some of those past harms? That's restorative engagement. And that's where hopefully we're all moving to on this journey from audience engagement to community engagement to restorative engagement. So, if we do that, if we evolve from audience engagement to community engagement, what we're talking about is the front of the byline journalism. And what do I mean by that? That means thinking about community or engaging with community even before you begin to write the story. Because typically, for some organizations, it's the other way around. You think about the story, all the decisions are made internally, and then you put the story out, and then you want to know, how is the community reacting to that story? That's a good thing. You want to know that. And that's awesome data to collect. And it helps provide information for you to correct maybe the next time. But thinking about the front of the byline journalism and how do we engage with communities in a way that we can gain some information, gain some insight before we even write the story. And think about, are we framing this in a way that may bring harm? Or are we framing this in a way that is more inclusive? And that's what we mean by front of the byline journalism, which is what community engagement helps you provide. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about, again, reporters and editors thinking beyond the current paradigm of your role, where you're a person who goes out and gathers information, writes that information down, edits that information, makes all the decisions, and gets it out. Thinking about yourself, beginning to think about yourself as a convener, as a connector for your community. That's the next step where your organization would truly be involved in community engagement. So let's talk about some community engagement practices that organizations are using. One of the things that many organizations do when they begin to think about, how do I get into community engagement? They think about community asset mapping. And what is that? It sounds really fancy, but it's really simple. It's thinking about, what are the strengths in our community? Or if you're thinking about focusing on a certain neighborhood in that community that your organization has not served, what are the assets in that community? Who are the people? Who are the assets? What are the businesses? What are the nonprofit organizations in that community? And actually mapping that out. Because as news organizations, and I worked in news for many, many years, for television, radio, newspapers, and I know, as a person who was a reporter and editor in these roles, that many times we go with the path of least resistance, meaning we have a set of sources that we work with, and when we're ready to do a story on, you name it, we say, hey, yeah, John so and so or Jane so and so, they're really great on that. I have a short time to turn that around. Let me reach out to John or Jane. So, when you take time to do that community asset mapping, it helps you think about that area more holistically and find people who can begin to be a part of your network that you hadn't thought about before. So, Pittsburgh Public Source, they are a shining example of an organization that has done this. They have been working with API for many years, and they are really honing their community engagement practices. And what they did was they decided to focus on communities that they would love to have as a part of their people who come to their site and who are not there. And so they reached out to Black and Brown communities in Pittsburgh and did specific asset mapping and community listening sessions with those specific communities to find out how can we do better. And that's one way that you can start off. The Honolulu Civic Speaks pop-up newsrooms is another example of how you can begin to engage with communities in different ways than you currently do. That's really a low barrier to entry. And what they did was they decided to partner with another great civic institution with their libraries and to begin to hold what they call pop-up newsrooms on the different islands. So they would take a reporter, editor, a team from their newsroom and put them in different libraries and then make sure the public knew that they were there and that these were pop-up sessions that were available for the public to come to. And so it was much easier for people to think about stopping by a room at the library to engage with the editors and the reporters than it would be for them to think about, oh, I'm going to come into your newsroom and just sit with you and chat with you for a while and talk about this story idea that I have, or talk about something that institution that I think you should know about. So that's one example of something that just about any newsroom could do that doesn't take a lot of money and it doesn't take a lot of effort. It just takes some planning. So the other hallmark of community engagement is thinking about listening, but listening in a different way. So, as journalists, we all feel like we listen. We have great listening skills. We talk to people all the time. We listen to them. We get information from them. And we bring that back to our newsrooms to tell our editors about what's going on the streets, right? That's what journalists are known for. Well, community listening sessions are a different way of approaching this process where you bring together a set group of folks to have really deep listening conversations, maybe over a set period of time. Sometimes it's to talk about one specific topic, or sometimes it's to talk about a series of issues that are going on in the community, but it's a way for newsrooms to have what's called a feedback loop. Because when you put stories out, sometimes you hear back about that story from maybe somebody you upset, or sometimes you don't hear feedback. The main feedback you have as a newsroom is, did people listen, watch, click on it? But what did people really feel about that story? How did it land? And how did it land in different communities? So I've put there the Pittsburgh Local News Advisory Group as an example of community listening sessions and deep listening. And this is a project that was led or is being led by the American Press Institute, where we're helping to bring together several different newsrooms in the city of Pittsburgh to have community listening sessions and to set up and work with an advisory group. This has been going on in Pittsburgh for several years. The groundwork was laid with a pilot program. They had the first set of listening sessions in 2024, and we're kicking it off again this year for another 2-year round of listening. And what it does is there's 5 newsrooms that are participating, and there's 8 community members who are handpicked from different neighborhoods around the city, and they'll come together in a regular cadence, basically about every month, to talk about what's happening in the local news environment and what regular people are thinking about how that's being covered by the local media. And they'll also have a couple community listening sessions that are very specific on certain topics. So that's what's going on in Pittsburgh. The Tennessean Storyteller series is also an effort that's been going on for a number of years. The Tennessean is a local newspaper in Nashville, and the editor there is very progressive and wanted to make sure that they were make all voices were being heard. They knew that they had a large percentage of African American folks in their community. I think it was about 24%, if I'm remembering that stat correctly. But they knew that their readership representation from that community was not nearly that number. So they embarked on a series of efforts throughout the community to bring in more African American voices through opinion pages, through special editorials, and then they learned from that, and then they did the same thing with the Hispanic community. And from that, they created a storyteller series where the folks that they have engaged with through these different community engagement practices are now contributing regularly to their newspaper, and they feel like they have definitely seen some wins through this project by increasing the connections with those communities through these years of community engagement efforts. And I say years because community engagement is not a one and done. It's not I have one listening session and then we're finished. Now we know what the community wants. Community engagement is an investment in the community that sometimes takes several months or sometimes several years to yield the results that you're looking for. So another way of thinking about how do I get into this? Because sometimes it might feel a little daunting. Oh my goodness, where do we start? We often hear that question, where do I start? So, one of the ways that organizations can think about starting is by just convening. And you can do it in a really fun and low stakes way of just bringing people together, not to talk about a particular story or even a series of stories. It's just, hey, come hang out with us, I guess is one way of putting it. So, one way that some organizations do it is things sort of like an ice cream social, right? You bring together people. You say, "Hey, we're going to have this ice cream social. We'd love for you to come and meet our news team, come and meet our editors." Because one of the things that we know is that there are many, many people who don't know a journalist. There's no journalist who's in their family. There's no journalist who's in their friend group. So they have no real idea of the kind of work that journalists do. Like, for example, if you have a police officer in your family, that gives you a whole different view about how police work and what they're up against. If you had a journalist in your family, that gives you a whole different view. So by bringing people together so they can just meet the folks in your organization by something as low stakes as the ice cream social is another way to do it. Civic workshops is another way to do it. Now, this is a journalism adjacent organization in Lexington, Kentucky, and they focus on making sure that people have better information so that they can be more civically involved. And so they put together a series of workshops so people could come out in the community and learn more about civic life, learn more about what's going on in their local community so that people could become more engaged around civics life. And that's one thing that news organizations can think about doing, because even though news organizations have a lot of smart people and a lot of resources in many cases, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can work with organizations who are already in spaces that you'd like to get into and partner with those organizations. And you could even let them take the lead in some of those meetings that you might have where you are a part of the conversation, but you're also partnering with that organization to do something like a civics workshop. So after news organizations begin to think about, well, how do we get into community engagement? You've thought about, well, we're a convener. You've thought about we're out here in the community. We're letting them know we're here. We're letting them know we want to be more of a listener. We've practiced our listening skills. We've done some deep listening. So then, what's next? Well, one of the great steps that news organizations can begin to do is thinking about co-creating solutions. Because one thing that we know that people want from their local newsrooms is not just to tell me the problems, help me figure out what the solutions are. And one of the things that you can think about is we don't have to know everything. We don't know everything. We don't have all of the solutions, but there are people out there who do. So through our ability to co-create, to bring people together, to convene people, to bring resources together, we can help create those solutions. So we give a couple examples here of some news organizations who've thought about, well, how do we do this? So Signal Ohio and City Bureau documenters are great examples of communities who've come together and say, what can we do to create solutions. So, as we know, as newsrooms are shrinking and getting smaller and smaller, there's less ability for reporters and news teams to be everywhere around the city. There was a time that there was a reporter at every council meeting, at every commission meeting, at every health department meeting, but that's just not something that most newsrooms can do now. So, what Signal Ohio and City Bureau documenters out of Chicago have done is they have thought about how do we train average citizens who are not journalists to go to these meetings, write down what happened. In other words, document what happens at these meetings, bring them back, and then we help them think through how we then take that information and we write that up as a story. So it's a way of extending the reach beyond the trained journalists in your newsroom and making sure that there's some accountability to public officials who have in some cases have gotten used to not having a journalist, not having any ears and eyes on their meetings. Green Line Action Journey is another example. Now, this is an organization out of Canada, and what they have done is they have decided that when they write a story, they're going to make sure that all these different components that we're talking about are a part of that. I shouldn't say a story, I should say a series, because they don't necessarily do this with every story. But when they have a series that they focus on, they start with that front of the byline journalism that we talked about in terms of bringing together people from the community to talk about it. They involve the citizens and keep that feedback loop going as they're creating their stories. And then for each of these stories that are part of these special series, they also have a solution aspect. So people know what to expect when they're putting together one of these special series. They know there's going to be a community engagement component in terms of deep listening. They know that they're going to continue to listen in the feedback loop, and they know a solution component is going to be part of the journalism that they're going to present to the community after they share, okay, here's the problem. Now, what's the solution as part of the journalism that they're going to present? So, when you think about the tools that you can use in community engagement, this graph just sort of represents the different tools that you can use and have in your toolkit. So, starting at the top, thinking about hero to host leadership. And what does that mean? That means that when you're leading a meeting or you're leading a team or you're leading a conversation, often it's very power centric and the person up front is leading everything. All the power rests with them. If you think about transitioning that thinking, and it's really a mindset shift, transitioning that to being the host. You're the facilitator. You're helping this group come together to think about the issue or think about the problem or think about what's being presented versus I'm up here and I have everything and I'm giving everything to you. That's the hero to host leadership. And another tool that you can have in your toolkit is the constructivist listening. And I mentioned this before, and that's where you have the deep listening and you're listening for understanding. You're not listening to just jump in. You're allowing someone to talk for a set period of time so that you can fully concentrate on what they're saying and listen for meaning and understanding in what that person is saying. And that's constructivist listening. And it's a really important part of the toolkit, particularly as newsrooms move into the space where they're convening and bringing communities together and getting into deep listening. So, listening with this mindset really goes a long way. And then another tool for your toolkit is setting community guidelines. So as you begin to have a set of meetings, as you begin to have a set of listening sessions, have some guidelines about how this meeting is going to go, how this interaction is going to go. So everyone knows the rules of the road and what our hope for outcomes are. And that can also be like that can be a shared conversation in terms of creating some of those community guidelines so that there's buy-in from everybody. Facilitation is also very important. As I was talking before about when you're going from that hero to host leadership, thinking about facilitating a meeting versus leading a meeting. When you're facilitating a meeting, you are the person that's helping everybody in the room have an opportunity to contribute, making sure that it's a safe space for everyone and that there are not the loud voices in the room are not always having the floor. There's some people who like to talk, and there's some people who like to sit back. Making sure those people who are sitting back also have a way to contribute to the conversation. And complicating the narrative, that's making sure that the narrative that we all carry around about certain issues, the narrative that we have in our mind, that doesn't stay the narrative that after you walk away from this particular engagement, that there's other thoughts, there's other voices that are brought into that narrative. So local journalism can model and equip their communities for conversations across differences. And that's what's really driving some of these new conversations around community engagement, bringing people together across differences and facilitating in spaces that are intentional and that are consistent. So people know what to expect and people feel safe in those spaces. So I'm going to stop here. For those of you who are watching, we would love it if you could click on this link or this QR code and let us know what you think about this information that I just shared. Was it a little bit overwhelming? Do you not know where to start? Was it just right? Was it useful for you? We would love to know what you thought about this.
Thank you so much, Marlene. This was really helpful to kind of frame how people are using community engagement. And I wanted to better understand, what are you seeing in terms of when organizations are doing that community engagement? Is there a material difference either in audience or readership or revenue that you're starting to see?
Yeah. So that's always the question, right? And people want to know where does this go? Does this lead to a return on the investment? And one thing that I have to say about community engagement is it's not going to contribute to increased revenue immediately. It's not going to contribute to increased viewers or listeners or people clicking onto your website immediately. It's a long-term play. And it's about investing in the community as much as it is about increasing the bottom line. And there are organizations that are seeing some increases, as I mentioned in one of the examples, the Tennessean storytellers. They are seeing increases in readership from those communities. They targeted specific communities, and they are seeing increases in, I should say, viewership in the African American community because they found that through their community engagement efforts that the American community there liked the video a little bit more than, say, the newsletter. And so by investing in those places, they have seen an increase. But it's been a long play. This has been years of them taking that time to do the deep listening, finding out what the communities who they felt were missing, where their voices were not a part of their coverage, and doing the work to make sure that they were responding to what they heard.
Thank you for that. I think that makes a lot of sense. If people have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll bring them up. It also occurs to me in hearing about community engagement that it's really like it's a total reframing of how newsrooms are interacting with readers. And so could you speak a little bit about how sort of what internal work needs to happen to have a successful community engagement process?
That's a great question because so often reporters or people who are not in a position to make decisions, higher up in the organization, they may come to a presentation like this, or they're somewhere at a conference and they hear about this and they take it back to their newsroom. And sometimes they meet with resistance. But one of the important things that we have found is that it's very important to have buy-in from the top. So for the top editor or the owners or the people who can make those decisions that we are going to have a shift in our newsroom and then drive it down from the top because it is difficult to drive it up from the bottom in terms of this mindset shift. But the other thing that is important in terms of the internal work is to help the entire newsroom understand that this practice is not a huge change from what journalists have been doing for years. Because if you think about it, when newspapers and other journalistic organizations were fully funded, when the ad revenues were still working the way that they used to work, and there was lots of reporters, many reporters were assigned to a beat, and there was an expectation that that reporter would know their beat inside and out, would know everybody who was a part of their beat, would sometimes go to community meetings with not the expectation of coming back with a story. It was that people there should know you and, the key word, trust you. So it was about trust building with the folks on your beat, so that then when there was a time that I need to write a story, good or bad, I already had built up that capital, that social capital with those people. So it's the same thing, but taking it to more of a newsroom framework, building that social capital with the community so that we build trust with the community, and particularly in groups in the community that do not trust us at all. Because as journalistic organizations, we know a couple things. We know that the current model is really not working well. And we also know that trust of journalistic organizations is at an all time low. So, helping the people who are inside the organization understand that true community engagement is a way to build trust and social capital in the community that will pay off in the long term.
That's so powerful, and really it kind of brings it back to the core values of serving the community and raising up voices that may not have been heard. And so just final question as we wrap up, what are the three takeaways? What if someone wants to start and maybe start small, maybe it's on their own beat or maybe in a smaller newsroom. What are the three things that you recommend that they do first?
Well, I would say start with listening. Start with listening to your community and start doing deep listening. So, whether you are bringing together a group for an advisory group, and an advisory group is a really, I won't say easy, but it's a low stakes way to get into deep listening by bringing together from people from different sectors of the community, maybe inviting people who have not been part of the folks that you listen to all the time or that you turn to all the time, and beginning to set up a series of meetings where you maybe have share your content with them if they're not regular users of your content, and getting the feedback from that group on how your content is actually landing in different parts of the community. And that's a very eye-opening process for most newsrooms, right? So think about starting small with perhaps a advisory group. And then you can broaden that out into wider convening and community listening, perhaps partnering with another organization to bring people together from across the community, a bigger group to do listening on. It might be a specific topic. Maybe there's something really big that's going on in your community that you'd be really interested in knowing what folks are thinking about it before you decide, okay, what are the stories we're going to write about it? So you bring people together in a big community listening session and find out what's on people's minds. You might get some sources that you hadn't thought of before. That shouldn't be the main goal to get the sources, but usually it is one of those unintended outcomes when you bring community together like that. And then I would say one of the other things that many organizations do is they actually do appoint someone on their team to be a community engagement specialist. So just like you might have a health beat or an education beat, you might have a community engagement beat. But it's very important when newsrooms assign someone as the community engagement person that they don't then put all of the onus on that one person to carry all of the community engagement for the organization on their shoulders, right? It's just that you have someone who can be continually thinking about it and leading the effort, but it still has to be a newsroom wide effort.
So start small, listen first, maybe an advisory board, then branch out from there and don't ghettoize it. Don't just put it as one person's responsibility, kind of take that in for the whole newsroom. And I thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think this has been terrific, a great sort of starter for those who are interested in community engagement. I know API has a lot of resources on this. How can people get in touch with you or learn more if they want to move forward?
Yeah, people can go to our website. We have a wealth of information on our website about community engagement, about with more examples than the ones that I've shared here today of how other newsrooms are doing it, how other newsrooms decided I'm going to start small, or they went all the way in to in on community engagement and decided to do a much bigger effort because maybe they got some funding from a nonprofit or something like that to go bigger, or sometimes they get funding from API to do different projects. So we have wonderful resources on our website. So please, please, if your newsroom is thinking about getting into this, please think about jumping on the API website first.
And if people are just listening along and not seeing the chat or the video, that's a bit.ly link. So https:// bit.ly/API MDCC resources. So I hope everyone takes advantage of that. And thank you so much, Marlene, for coming to talk to
Sure.
us. This was
And I just
great.
want to say that I'm at Marlene, Marlene Harris-Taylor at pressinstitute.org. People can reach out to me if they have questions. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Marlene. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.